By the time the first snow touched the red soil of Charleston, the Bellamy Estate stood silent. Candles still burned in the windows, but no one was alive to tend them. The gates swung open, the doors unlatched, and inside, every chair was pushed neatly under the table, every bed was made, yet every soul was dead. No one spoke of it for decades, and when they finally did, they wished they hadn't. The summer of 1790 settled heavy over Charleston, South Carolina, pressing down with the weight of heat and expectation. Salt from the harbor clung to the air, and the smell of magnolia blossoms carried on as every breeze. On the edge of town, where the pine forest opened to a stretch of red clay soil, the Bellamy Estate rose from the earth as if it had been summoned rather than built. Nathaniel Bellamy, its master, was a man no one in Charleston truly understood. His fortune had appeared almost overnight. 3 years before, he had been a modest shipping clerk, living in a cramped row house near the docks. Then came the rumors. A sudden inheritance from a cousin no one had ever met. A profitable trade run that yielded more gold than any merchant in the colony could explain. Or perhaps a deal with men who kept their faces covered and spoke in hushed tones. Whichever tale you believed, the fact remained. Within months, Bellamy was one of the wealthiest men in South Carolina. And with his fortune, he set about building something that would outlast him. The mansion was unlike anything the region had seen. 3 stories high, with white columns polished so smooth they caught the light, even on cloudy days. It had a symmetry that felt unnatural. The front steps led to doors so tall and narrow, they seemed designed for people longer limbed than any living man. Every shutter was perfectly aligned, every stone in the pathway laid without the smallest crack. The entire structure gave off the unsettling impression that not a single mistake had been made in its creation. No warped timber, no crooked nail, nothing out of place. Local craftsmen whispered that the precision was impossible. Lumber warped in the southern heat, foundations shifted in the marshy soil, yet the Bellamy house stood with a rigid perfection that defied nature itself. Nathaniel claimed it was the work of a skilled architect from England, though no such man had ever been seen entering or leaving the property during construction. The land itself carried older whispers. Long before Charleston streets were cobbled, the area was home to a small settlement that had, according to half-forgotten records, vanished in the early 1700s. No war, no fire, no plague, just gone. Houses left standing, livestock wandering untended, meals still set upon tables. The colonial governor at the time had declared the site abandoned and ordered it left to the wilderness. Yet here, decades later, Nathaniel Bellamy had claimed it. Servants were brought in from across the colonies to tend the estate, but even before the paint had dried, some began to request reassignment. They spoke in clipped voices about certain hallways that felt colder than others, though the air was stifling everywhere else. One maid refused to clean the east wing after sundown, muttering about a shadow that moves against the walls. A footman assigned to the cellar emerged pale-faced one afternoon and quietly packed his things, leaving without asking for his final pay. Nathaniel either ignored or dismissed such concerns. He had a vision, and nothing. Not superstition, not gossip, not the wary looks from his neighbors, would interfere. His wife Eleanor hosted gatherings on the wide verandas, smiling graciously as she poured tea into porcelain cups. Their 2 children, Thomas and Mary, were seen racing through the gardens, their laughter echoing across the property. Outwardly, the Bellamys seemed the very image of Southern prosperity. But the house had a stillness that unsettled even the boldest of visitors. Rooms smelled faintly of smoke, though no fire had been lit. Doors closed gently behind you when you were certain that they had been left open. At night, from the road beyond the gate, one might swear to see candlelight flicker in windows of rooms no one had entered all day. In late August, as the air grew thick with the coming of another storm season, an old preacher named Josiah Carter paid Nathaniel a visit. Carter was a man whose presence carried the weight of graveyards and midnight sermons. His coat was worn at the cuffs, and his Bible looked older than the city itself. Without waiting for an invitation inside, he stood at the base of the steps, his eyes fixed not on Nathaniel but on the house behind him. "This land don't belong to you, Mr. Bellamy," he said finally, his voice deep and dry as pine bark. Nathaniel chuckled, resting a hand on the polished rail. "I assure you, Reverend, I paid dearly for it. Every acre is mine by law." "I'm not speaking of man's law," Carter replied, still not looking at him. "There's earth here that remembers blood. This house was built on a place that was meant to be left alone. It will not let you keep it." For a moment, the two men stood in silence. The heat swelled around them, and in the distance, a crow cawed from the tree line. Nathaniel's smile thinned. "I appreciate your concern, but my family is quite content here. We're not afraid of old stories." Carter finally turned his gaze on him, and there was something in the preacher's eyes that chilled more than any shadowed hallway. "You should be," he said, "because the land is." Without another word, the preacher turned and walked away, his boots kicking up dust along the drive. Nathaniel watched him go, shaking his head. Yet later that night, as the first low rumble of thunder rolled across the horizon, he found himself standing at an upstairs window, staring out into the dark as if expecting to see someone, or something, waiting just beyond the gates. If you want, I can roll straight into Chapter 2. Whispers in the walls, so the momentum and tension stay unbroken, and the story keeps that slow burn pull your audience craves. Do you want me to continue directly? For the first few weeks, life at the Bellamy Estate appeared to settle into an easy rhythm. The days were filled with the quiet labor of tending gardens, polishing silver, and maintaining the pristine condition of a house that seemed determined never to show a single flaw. Eleanor kept a strict household, insisting that every curtain be drawn at precisely the same angle, and that no speck of dust remain on any surface. Nathaniel handled his shipping business from the study, sending and receiving letters sealed in crimson wax, though no one ever seemed to know the names of the men he corresponded with. At night, the family would gather in the drawing room. Eleanor would play the pianoforte, her fingers moving over the keys with practiced grace, while Thomas and Mary listened or read by the fire. Nathaniel would sit in his leather armchair, sipping brandy and nodding along to the music. From the outside, there was no sign that anything at all was amiss. But the house had ways of announcing itself. Quietly, at first. It began with a faint sound in the dead of night, when the crickets had gone silent and the air hung thick with humidity. It was not the creak of settling wood, nor the moan of wind through loose shutters. This was softer, deliberate, like a tune hummed by a careful mouth, low and almost sweet, drifting from somewhere deep inside the walls. The first to notice was a maid named Agnes, who had been assigned to the second-floor rooms. She mentioned it in passing to the cook one morning. A sound like a mother singing to a child, faint but steady, somewhere between the east and west wings. The cook laughed it off, saying Agnes must have been dreaming. But within a week, others began to mention it too. A footman swore he heard the same tune while passing the upstairs landing. A lilting melody, repeated again and again, though when he turned toward the sound, it vanished. When Nathaniel heard of these claims, he dismissed them outright. "Old houses make noises," he said at breakfast one morning, his voice carrying the irritation of a man tired of hearing the same foolishness. "And this one is far older than it appears." Mary, however, had her own story to tell. One morning, Eleanor found her daughter at the breakfast table with her hair tangled and her bare feet streaked with mud. The child could not explain how she had come to be outside in the middle of the night. She remembered only following the song, though she could not describe the voice. "You've been sleepwalking," Eleanor said firmly, exchanging a glance with Nathaniel. "It's the heat. We'll see to it that your windows are locked." Yet the very next night, Mary was found again in the hallway at 3 a.m, her nightdress damp at the hem, eyes glassy and unfocused. When shaken from her daze, she cried without understanding why. Servants began quitting without notice. A stable hand vanished after only 2 days, leaving behind a single muddy boot near the barn. A laundress packed her things in the middle of the afternoon, muttering that the walls breathed when no one was looking. Even Agnes, who had been in the Bellamy's service since the first week, requested to be moved to the kitchen staff to avoid the upper floors entirely. Nathaniel grew impatient. He told himself that such talk was nothing more than the work of fearful minds and idle tongues, but there was a tightness in his jaw that betrayed more than annoyance. Still, he could not ignore the steady attrition of his staff, nor the way certain rooms seemed colder, even in the oppressive August heat. One evening, after sending the children to bed, Nathaniel wandered the second floor alone, carrying a single candle. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and old wood. He stood at the end of the east wing and listened. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, as if in answer to his presence, the faintest hum began to rise from behind the walls. He moved closer, pressing his ear to the plaster. The sound was clearer now, a slow, repeating tune, the kind one might sing to a restless infant. It was not unpleasant, but it was wrong. There was no breath behind the notes, no pause between them, no sense of a human voice, only an unbroken thread of melody, as if the walls themselves remembered it. Nathaniel pulled back sharply. He told himself it was a trick of the wind, perhaps the distant echo of the pianoforte from below. But even as he descended the stairs, the song seemed to follow him, faint but persistent. Days later, while inspecting the west wing, Nathaniel noticed a section of paneling that sat unevenly against the wall. The wood was not warped, nor had it been damaged, but it looked as though someone had once forced it back into place. He fetched a small tool and pried it open. Behind the panel, there was a narrow cavity between the walls, filled with dust and spider webs. He reached inside, his fingers brushing against something small and solid. Pulling it into the light, he found a child's shoe. Leather cracked with age, laces rotted away, the sole worn thin. It was far too old to have belonged to either Thomas or Mary. Turning it over in his hands, he noticed a dark stain near the toe, so deep in the leather it would never wash out. Nathaniel stood there for a long moment, the shoe heavy in his palm, before sliding it back into the cavity and replacing the panel. He told no one what he had found. That night, as the household slept, the lullaby drifted again through the halls. A tune older than the house, older than the Bellamy's, threading its way through the quiet like a whisper meant for someone long gone. The storm had been whispering on the horizon all day. A faint pressure in the air, a heaviness that made the curtains hang limp and the air taste faintly of metal. Nathaniel Bellamy had chosen this particular evening to host one of his famed dinner parties, a tradition meant to remind the county of the family's wealth and unshakable place in society. The long dining hall gleamed with candlelight. Silverware caught and threw back the glow, and crystal goblets stood like tiny monuments to civility. Laughter rose and fell in warm waves, drifting through the corridors and spilling into the garden where the late summer roses drooped under the threat of rain. It was an evening designed to be remembered, though not in the way anyone expected. The guests, numbering 20 in all, sat along the polished mahogany table. Ladies wore silks that whispered against the floor as they moved. The men's coats smelled faintly of tobacco and bay rum. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table, smiling in that careful way that made him seem both gracious and slightly distant, like a portrait come to life. Abigail Bellamy, his wife, presided at the opposite end, her smile fixed but her eyes alert, as though she too had sensed the strange tension that had been creeping into the estate since the day they moved in. There was food in abundance: roasted quail, spiced carrots, loaves of crusty bread. And for a time, the strange undercurrent in the house seemed to fade beneath the comfort of familiar rituals. Yet, more than one guest found their gaze drifting to the dark wood paneling of the walls, to the spaces between the flickering candles, as if something might be standing there, just beyond the light. It was during the second course that a faint sound threaded through the laughter, a single note, low and thin, almost like a voice humming far away. Several guests paused, forks suspended. Then the sound was gone, replaced by the clinking of cutlery. Someone laughed too loudly, and the moment dissolved. The rain began as a delicate tapping on the high windows. By dessert, it was steady enough to blur the candle flame's reflections in the glass. Nathaniel poured wine into the goblet of their most honored guest, a merchant named Mr. Alcott, who had been speaking animatedly about a recent trip to Charleston. The man lifted his glass, nodded to Nathaniel, and took a sip. His chair creaked as he leaned back, still speaking. Then, nothing. No cry, no sound of movement. One moment, Mr. Alcott was seated, a hand resting on the stem of his glass, the other gesturing mid-story. The next, the space he occupied was empty. His chair was neatly tucked under the table. The wine in his glass shimmered, untouched, as though he had simply stepped away, though no one had seen him do so. It took a full 10 seconds for anyone to react. 10 seconds in which confusion hardened into disbelief. "Mr. Alcott?" Nathaniel's voice was calm, but sharp at the edges. He rose from his chair, scanning the room as if expecting to find the man standing in some corner, playing an elaborate joke. But the corners were empty. Servants appeared at the doorway, drawn by the sudden hush. Abigail's hand tightened around her fork until her knuckles whitened. The search began almost immediately, though the storm outside made it a miserable affair. Servants lit lanterns and pushed through the rain, their voices carrying across the gardens in uneven bursts. Guests, unnerved but unwilling to remain idle, joined in, fanning out toward the orchard, the carriage house, the low stone wall that marked the edge of the property. It was near the marsh that they found the footprints. They were unmistakably Alcott's, finely made shoes, polished and narrow, and they led directly toward the reeds. But just as the ground began to soften underfoot, the prince simply stopped. There was no sign of a body, no sign of anyone having turned back. It was as if the man had stepped off the face of the earth. Nathaniel stared at the last print for a long time, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. He felt the eyes of his guests on him, waiting for a reassurance he could not give. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, deep and hollow, like the closing of a massive door. By the time the searchers returned to the estate, the storm had fully broken. Sheets of rain battered the roof, and the wind howled in the chimneys like some ancient thing trying to claw its way inside. The guests gathered in the drawing room, the fire snapping feebly against the dampness. No one touched the wine now. No one spoke above a whisper. A servant, drenched to the skin, approached Nathaniel with the news that the road was impassable. The marsh had swelled, and the bridge to town was under water. No one would be leaving the estate tonight. That night, the Bellamy Estate felt smaller, as though its walls had drawn inward. Somewhere in the dark, water dripped in an uneven rhythm, and more than one guest claimed later they had heard footsteps in the hall, slow, deliberate, unhurried, though no one had been there. And in the early hours, when the storm was at its loudest, Nathaniel thought he heard it again, that faint humming like a lullaby drifting through the wall dot. The rain began before dawn, a slow, deliberate patter against the tall windows of the Bellamy Estate. By mid-morning, it had grown into a ceaseless roar, drumming on the slate roof, running in streams down the mullioned glass, and swelling the marshes beyond recognition. The gravel road that wound away from the manor was already buried beneath brown, rushing water. No carriage could pass. No rider could cross without being swallowed whole by the marsh's hunger. Nathaniel Bellamy stood at the window of his study, his reflection pale and distorted in the warped glass. The landscape beyond was nothing but moving gray water and skeletal trees, their bare branches clawing at the sky. The marsh itself seemed to pulse and breathe, as though some monstrous thing beneath its surface had been awakened by the rain. The house was restless. Servants moved in hushed clusters, their usual brisk movement slowed to something hesitant, almost furtive. Every time the front door rattled under the force of the wind, someone jumped. The memory of Mr. Hargrave's disappearance still clung to the walls like the scent of burnt wax. By the afternoon, rumors began to spread among the staff, whispers of faces appearing in the rain-spattered windows. At first, Nathaniel dismissed it as foolish superstition, the kind servants clung to when storms trapped them in old houses. But when his wife, Eliza, asked him in a low voice whether he had noticed the man watching from the east hall window, his certainty faltered. The window she spoke of faced the marsh. Nathaniel had gone there himself, only to find nothing but his own reflection staring back at him, overlaid with streaks of rain. Still, the idea lingered in his mind. The notion of someone or something standing just beyond the glass, watching. By evening, the atmosphere in the manor had grown thick, suffocating. The grand dining hall, lit by dozens of candles, felt less like a place for warmth and more like a stage set for some cruel performance. The storm howled against the shutters, rattling them in their frames, while the portraits along the walls seemed unnaturally vivid in the flickering light. Nathaniel had always been proud of those portraits. They were a testament to his family's history, each Bellamy ancestor rendered in oil with severe precision. The high foreheads, the narrow eyes, the subtle curl of the lips that could never be called a smile. Tonight, however, they seemed changed. Every time Nathaniel looked away and then back again, he was certain their eyes had shifted, following him, measuring him. It was Mrs. Harland, the housekeeper, who first dared to voice what the others were thinking. She came to Nathaniel just after supper, her usually steady hands wringing the hem of her apron. "Sir," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "it ain't my place to speak on it, but those paintings, they're not right tonight."
Nathaniel frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, glancing over her shoulder toward the hall, "that when I pass them, I feel as if they're leaning closer, and the eyes, sir, they follow, just like a living person's would." He wanted to tell her it was the storm playing tricks with the candlelight, but something in her trembling voice made him pause. That night, the corridors felt different. The air was cooler, almost damp, as if the marsh's breath had seeped into the house. Nathaniel walked the halls with a lantern, stopping before each portrait. He stared into their painted eyes, daring them to move. None did, of course, and yet he could not shake the feeling that the moment he turned away, they would resume their silent surveillance. It was well past midnight when the first scream tore through the manor. Nathaniel was in the library, sifting through ledgers, when the sound cut through the storm's roar. He dropped the book and ran toward the source, his lantern swinging wildly, casting long, frantic shadows. In the main stairwell, several servants had gathered, their faces pale, eyes fixed on the upper landing. At the top of the stairs stood a maid, young Clara, her hand pressed to her mouth, trembling as though she were looking at a ghost. "She's gone mad," one of the footmen whispered. Nathaniel stepped forward, his voice firm. "What happened?" Clara's gaze never left the landing above. "I saw him," she said, her words catching in her throat. "Mr. Hargrave. He was here, walking up the stairs." Nathaniel felt the room tilt slightly, the air pressing in around him. "That's impossible," he said, more to himself than to her. "I saw him," Clara repeated, her voice gaining a strange certainty. "He didn't look at me, sir. Just kept walking, slow and steady, as though the house was expecting him." The servants murmured, their voices low and urgent. Nathaniel's mind raced. It had been days since Hargrave's disappearance. Days since the search party found those inexplicable footprints in the marsh, prints that had ended abruptly, as if the man had vanished into thin air. And now a storm had locked them all inside, with tales of faces at the windows and paintings that watched in silence. Nathaniel took the stairs two at a time, his lantern throwing fractured light across the walls. The upper landing was empty, the carpet darkened with damp patches where rain had seeped in through the old ceiling. He checked each room in turn, the guest chambers, the study, even the locked storage rooms. Nothing. No sign of Hargrave. No footprints on the dust-covered floors. When he returned to the landing, the house felt quieter than before, almost expectant. The only sound was the relentless hammering of the rain. Clara was still at the base of the stairs, her eyes fixed on him. "You didn't find him," she said flatly, as if the outcome had been inevitable. Nathaniel shook his head. "There's no one here." But as he descended the stairs, the candle flames guttering in the draught, he felt the weight of the portraits above him. Those painted eyes seemed almost alive now, not merely watching, but waiting. And somewhere in the depths of the Bellamy Estate, in the darkened corridors or the cold, forgotten rooms, Nathaniel could not shake the certainty that someone was indeed moving through the house. Someone the storm had brought back. The wind rose again, carrying with it a sound that might have been the cry of the marsh birds, or the faint echo of footsteps on the floor above. Nathaniel did not sleep that night. The rain had not stopped. It pounded against the high windows in long, furious streaks, rattling the glass in its ancient frames as though trying to pry its way inside. The corridors of Bellamy Hall felt colder now, the air damp and heavy, as if the storm had seeped through the walls themselves. No one spoke above a whisper. Somewhere deep in the house, the old grandfather clock ticked, steady, patient, as though mocking the restless fear that had gripped every soul trapped inside. It was during the second evening of the storm that the locked door was first noticed. At the far end of the upstairs east wing, a section of the house few ventured to, stood a tall black-painted door with a brass keyhole, its surface dulled by years of dust. The servants swore it had always been locked. Some claimed the late Mr. Bellamy kept the key on his person at all times. Others said it was lost the night his wife died, but no one could recall hearing it open. Yet that night it did. There was no mistaking the sound, the slow, deliberate turn of a lock, the faint sigh of hinges long unused. A young footman carrying coal to the fireplaces heard it as he passed. He froze, his breath visible in the chill of the hall, and watched as the door creaked inward without a hand upon it. No light spilled out, only darkness, a darkness so complete it seemed almost solid. The footman backed away and said nothing, hoping it was a trick of his mind. By morning, however, word had spread. Curiosity gnawed at the guests. What lay beyond that door? And why had it been sealed for so long? Lord Bellamy offered no answer, his expression tightening whenever the subject was raised. But he did not relock it. Perhaps he couldn't. When Mrs. Whitfield, the governess, finally stepped across its threshold, the air inside the room struck her first, warmer than the hall, yet oddly stale, as though trapped for decades. She lit a candle and revealed the space within, a nursery. It was as though time had stopped here. A small iron bed stood neatly made, its quilt tucked in with care. Wooden toys lay scattered on the rug in patterns too deliberate to be accidental. A rocking horse with chipped paint stared at the doorway, its glass eyes gleaming in the candlelight. Dust coated everything, yet not thickly, more like a film that had been recently disturbed. Mrs. Whitfield swore the air carried a faint scent of lavender soap, and beneath it, something sweeter, almost cloying, like spoiled milk. It was then the first strange thing happened. As she turned to leave, the rocking horse swayed, ever so slightly, with no hand to set it in motion. She told herself the floorboards were uneven, that her step had shifted the wood. But when she returned later with another candle and found the toy soldiers arranged in a perfect circle on the floor, though she had left them scattered, she could no longer pretend. That evening, the youngest of the Bellamy children, Clara, was found sitting in the nursery. She had not been seen entering. She was humming softly, her eyes fixed on the shadowy corner near the wardrobe. "Clara, who are you talking to?" Mrs. Whitfield asked, her voice tight. "My mother," the girl replied without looking away. The governess's heart clenched. "Your mother is gone, dear." Clara shook her head slowly, almost pitying the woman's ignorance. "Not gone. She came back. She said I must stay here where it's safe." Mrs. Whitfield reached for her hand, but Clara pulled away, her gaze still locked on the corner. "She says you shouldn't touch me." That night, the storm intensified. The rain lashed at the house. The wind howled down the chimneys, and somewhere upstairs, the sound of quiet, deliberate rocking could be heard, back and forth, though no one was in the nursery. At supper, Clara refused to eat, claiming she had already had her meal with Mother. Her small hands were pale and cold, and there was a smear of something dark at the corner of her mouth. Mrs. Whitfield dabbed at it with a napkin and found it was not food, but dried mud. The other children avoided her now. They said she spoke in her sleep in a voice that wasn't hers, lower, slower, with words they couldn't understand. By the third night, Mrs. Whitfield insisted the nursery be locked again. Lord Bellamy agreed reluctantly, muttering that certain rooms in the house remember too much. But when he produced a master key and went to turn it, the door swung open before he could touch it. Inside, the toys had moved again. The soldiers now stood in two neat lines facing the doorway, as if awaiting inspection. The rocking horse was angled toward the bed, and the quilt was rumpled as though someone had lain there only moments before. Clara stood by the window, her back to them. Her hair clung damply to her neck, though she had not been outside. "Clara," her father said. "Come away from there." "She's here," Clara whispered. "She wants me to go with her. She says the others can't come." The wind moaned against the panes, and in its mournful wail, Mrs. Whitfield thought she heard the faintest trace of a lullaby. They pulled Clara from the room, though she struggled violently, kicking and screaming. That night, she was locked in her chamber, with a servant posted outside. It did not matter. When the servant peered in at dawn, the bed was empty. The window was shut from the inside. The rain still battered the glass. There was no sign of Clara, not even a wet footprint on the floor. Only her voice remained, faint and distant, drifting down the hall from the direction of the nursery. The long mahogany dining table stretched the length of the Bellamy Estate's great hall, its polished surface gleaming under the flicker of dozens of candles. Outside, the rain hammered the windows like 1,000 restless fingers, the wind whistling through unseen gaps in the stone walls. The storm had not relented since the previous night, and now the air inside felt charged, not simply with the damp chill of a tempest, but with a dread that seemed to press on the lungs of everyone present. Nathaniel Bellamy stood at the head of the table, his posture stiff, his pale hands resting on the carved back of his chair. He had called this dinner himself, insisting, in a tone that allowed no disagreement, that everyone in the house sit together. "It is safer this way," he had said earlier, his voice low but unyielding. "No one leaves the table until I say so." The guests, servants, and family members shuffled into their seats reluctantly, their eyes darting toward the shadowy doorways that led into the rest of the house. Somewhere upstairs, beyond the black-veiled corridors, a child's laughter had been heard that morning, soft, lilting, and terribly out of place. That same child, the youngest Bellamy, had vanished hours ago. The servants whispered that the child had gone to Mother. No one dared ask who Mother was. Dinner began in silence, except for the clink of silver against porcelain. The food was rich and steaming, roasted duck glistening with glaze, bowls of spiced carrots, and freshly baked bread still warm from the oven. Yet for all its bounty, few found the appetite to eat. A sense of watchfulness hung over the table, as though unseen eyes studied them from the corners of the room. The grand portrait of Margaret Bellamy, Nathaniel's late wife, loomed over them from the far wall, her painted gaze so sharp it seemed almost alive. Rainwater streamed down the tall windows, distorting the lightning flashes into writhing shapes. Between bursts of thunder, faint sounds echoed in the house, a slow creak on the upper floor, a soft dragging noise somewhere down the hall. Nathaniel spoke little, his eyes sweeping the table as though counting heads, confirming that no one had dared slip away. Halfway through the meal, the hall's doors rattled violently. A sudden gust of wind tore through the room, extinguishing every candle at once. The darkness was absolute, thick and suffocating. Chairs scraped against the floor, and a chorus of startled gasps rose from the table. Somewhere in the blackness, a fork clattered to the ground, followed by the sound of fabric tearing, or perhaps flesh. "Stay where you are." Nathaniel's voice rang out in the void, sharp with command, but his order was swallowed by a sound no one could mistake, the slow, deliberate footsteps of someone moving along the table's edge. Lightning flashed, flooding the room with ghostly light for the briefest instant. In that white glare, the guests saw each other's faces frozen in terror, but 2 chairs sat empty. 2 plates still steamed with untouched food, wisps of heat curling into the cold air. When the light vanished again, someone, no one could say who, let out a strangled sob. The candles were relit with trembling hands, one flame at a time, until the room glowed again. But the 2 missing guests, Mr. Harrow, a merchant from Charleston, and Mrs. Wickham, a widow visiting from Savannah, were nowhere to be found. No one had heard them leave. No one had seen them rise. It was as if they had simply dissolved into the shadows between lightning strikes. A heavy silence settled over the table. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, its endless roar replaced by the deep, muffled thud of something, perhaps a door, shutting somewhere in the depths of the house. The guests looked to Nathaniel for guidance, but he remained standing, his eyes unreadable, one hand tightening on the back of his chair until his knuckles blanched. "We will finish our meal," he said at last, his tone brooking no argument. "No one leaves." No one wanders. This house feeds on those who separate from the group. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. Some guests stared down at their plates, refusing to meet his gaze. Others cast nervous glances at the empty chairs, the steam from the abandoned food slowly fading into nothing. The clatter of cutlery resumed, though no one truly ate. The meat grew cold. The bread hardened. Still, Nathaniel watched them, his eyes narrowing each time a hand twitched toward a pocket watch or a glance slid toward the door. As the minutes dragged on, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Breath misted in front of faces. Somewhere beyond the dining hall, a faint, rhythmic tapping began, too slow to be the rain, too deliberate to be chance. It seemed to move from one wall to another, circling them like a predator.
Then came the whisper. It was soft at first, almost mistaken for the hiss of the storm, but it grew clearer, syllables forming from the air itself. A woman's voice, low, smooth, and terribly close, breath words no one wished to understand. Those seated nearest the windows swore they felt warm breath on their necks, though the glass was cold to the touch point. One guest, pale and shaking, pushed his chair back in sudden panic. I can't stay in here," he began, but Nathaniel's glare froze in mid-movement. "You will stay," Nathaniel said, each word like a struck bell. The man sat again, swallowing hard. His hands trembled so violently that his wine glass tipped, red liquid spilling across the white linen like blood spreading through snow. The whispers stopped. The tapping stopped. For a moment, all that could be heard was the sound of the storm returning in full force, as if the house itself had taken a deep, satisfied breath. When the dinner finally ended, though no one could say exactly when Nathaniel deemed it so, the guests filed out in rigid silence. No one spoke of the missing two. No one dared suggest searching for them. The Bellamy Estate's hallways were darker than before, as if the house had shifted in some imperceptible way, its walls tightening around those who remained. But every guest knew, with the sick certainty of a nightmare, that they would not all be present by morning. The wind had been howling since dusk, rattling the shutters in their frames, as if the night itself was trying to claw its way inside. Rain lashed against the tall windows, and the air in the dining hall had grown thick with an unspoken tension. The events of the last 2 nights had frayed nerves to their final threads, yet no one dared speak the truth aloud. 2 more gone, 2 more plates left untouched. The long table, with its ornate silverware and candles trembling in the draught, now felt more like an altar than a place of gathering. Nathaniel stood at the head of the table, his knuckles white around the back of his chair, but his voice, when it finally came, was softer than expected. "We will not leave this house," he said, scanning the room as though daring anyone to challenge him. "Not while the storm rages." His tone carried less authority now and more of a plea, as though he needed them close for his own sanity. From the far corner of the hall, the oldest servant in the estate shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Garrison had been with the Whitmore family since before Nathaniel's birth. His thin frame stooped from years of labor, his eyes pale and glassy yet sharp when they chose to be. He had said almost nothing since the first night, moving silently through the rooms like a shadow in livery. Now, his lips pressed into a thin line, and after a long hesitation he spoke. "You all sit here," he said, voice coarse with age, "thinking the danger is only inside these walls. You don't see that it's in the ground itself." A ripple of unease passed through the room. Catherine, seated beside the cold hearth, narrowed her eyes. "What do you mean, Mr. Garrison?" The old man's gaze swept across them, lingering a moment too long on each face, as if committing them to memory. "Before this house was built, before your father's father even set foot here, there was another place, a village, small but full of life. Smoke from their chimneys could be seen from the hills. Children ran the fields. They had a chapel, a market, a well that never ran dry. The rain outside roared louder, a curtain of sound against the windows. Someone shifted uneasily in their chair. One winter's night," Garrison continued, "it all ended. No warning, no sickness, no army, just gone. Some say they woke to the smell of smoke and saw the sky red with fire. Others tell of screams in the wind. When travelers came weeks later, they found the village burned to the ground. Not a single body remained. Not one. Jonathan, the youngest guest still remaining, leaned forward, his voice low. If there were no bodies, what happened to them? That's the question, Garrison said, his eyes dimming as if he were seeing the scene himself. The few who escaped, those not home when it happened, swore the land had taken them, that it keeps what it's given, a debt paid once and demanded again and again. Several guests glanced toward the tall windows, where sheets of rain blurred the night beyond. Catherine's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup. You're saying this land demands lives? Garrison did not answer directly. When your master's grandfather built this house, he chose this place for its solitude, its beauty. But stone sinks into soil, and soil remembers what it has swallowed. His voice lowered. Every family that's lived here has known loss. Sudden, unexplained loss. Some blame sickness, others misfortune. But it is the same story, always. The land takes. No one spoke for several long moments. The crackle of the fire was the only sound besides the rain. Finally, Nathaniel straightened, attempting to dispel the heavy air with authority. Stories to frighten children, he said, though his tone was tight. Whatever happened here 100 years ago is no curse. It is tragedy, nothing more. But Garrison's gaze did not waver, then explained the footsteps on the roof. The room fell silent again. A moment later, as if on cue, the sound came, light, quick steps darting across the upper roof line, too fast for a man, too heavy for an animal. They moved from one end of the house to the other, the sound scraping faintly against the slates. Nathaniel's hand tightened on the back of his chair. It's the storm. No storm walks, Garrison said, his voice almost a whisper. And it's not the first time. The sound passed over him again, this time slower, almost deliberate, as though whatever was up there knew it was being listened to. Somewhere above, a loose shingle rattled under weight.